Okay, for today's lecture, we'll simply cover project risk management and monitoring and control. Okay. Okay. Yes. Okay. First, in terms of the intro, we'll just recap what you have done so far. Okay, so within the project lifecycle, where we are now, we are mainly focusing on project execution, and we are heading into monitoring and control, and then closing of the project. Okay, so this is how it looks. So we have done initiation, we have done planning. That's where we are dealing with network diagrams, web program structure, all that. And now we are mainly focusing on execution, and then control. We'll do control today also. Closure, we'll do it later. Okay, so when you are executing your project, you might have some risks which are associated with the project. So the risk comes with uncertainty that you might have, because some of the things you might experience unplanned events that will either affect your project either in a positive way or a negative way. So that's what we want to focus on today. And then like that, it means we are almost about to round off with execution. Okay, so a risk is basically the possibility that that project targets will be exceeded or they will not be achieved due to something unexpected or unplanned that may happen. So a risk basically, a risk can actually be positive or it can be negative according to the PM book. So if it's negative, it means it's affecting your project. Like let's say you end up not reaching your targets or you will not achieve your deliverables. But sometimes it can also be positive in such a way that it affects your project in a whereby you end up benefiting from that unplanned event. So when it comes to risk management now, what you want to do is you want to have control over this situation. So what risk management is about, it's all about identifying that risk. So you know that there are possible risks that you might experience, and then you need to assess those risks in terms of potential consequences that might result from them. You can call it consequences or severity or the impact of that specific risk, and also the likelihood or the probability that it might happen. And from there, you would then have to develop and implement plan, or so this will be your action plan that you implement so that you can minimize or maximize the positive or negative effects of that risk. So it depends now on what risk you are facing. Are we together up to there?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So in terms of your risk management, it starts off first with identifying the risks. So first you need to identify those risks. Once you have done identifying the risks, there are a number of techniques that you can use to identify those risks. We'll look at them. Then you assess that risk. When you are assessing the risk, you do it mainly in terms of what is the likelihood or what is the probability or chance that that risk might occur. And if it's to occur, what will be the impact on the project? And then after that, you treat that risk. This is when now you are coming up with a plan or a strategy on how you will handle those risks. And then after that, you implement that strategy. While you are implementing it, you need to monitor and control. And while you are monitoring and controlling and implementing those changes, sometimes you might introduce new risks also in that process. So you need to identify again those risks. And then you assess them again, you treat them, you monitor. So it becomes cyclic, you see. Okay, so the question now is in terms of identifying risks. So what are some of the techniques that you can use to identify the risks? So where do you start? If you have to identify risks, where do you start? There is something called a risk factor. A risk factor is basically just a situation that might give rise to one or more project risks. So basically, a risk factor is like an indicator, something that indicates that there's a possibility that you might have risks associated with this project. A simple example, if let's say this is the first time you are doing that specific project, and there are risks involved, there's a high chance that something can go wrong because you are not, let's say you are not well experienced in that, or you did not do proper consultations when it comes to that. So that's the risk factor. So you need to identify all those risk factors, because those risk
Wait,
factors, they give you an indication of that something unplanned might happen.
Sir,
Yes.
now let's say I'm starting a new project. How do I know what the risk factor is? Or in any project, how do I first consider the safety measures? Or
Yes, you can even look at it like in terms of that. But there are things that you might think, what can possibly go wrong? You can think of it like that.
mm,
Let's
so
say now
it's
you want to do a project in Essex, but that project involves you igniting something.
mm,
You can already see it's a risk by itself. The
mm,
it's an indication that if you want to make to set the fire, but it's in Essex, it's organic there, so it's a big
yeah.
problem. It's possible that
so
it's
sir,
the first time you are working on that project also.
so sir,
Yes.
the risk factor is basically accounted by the experience one would have in that field or what?
Yeah, yeah. That's one of the ways to look at it. That's because you need to consult also with your seniors who are more experienced, so they can give you
Mm.
some hints on what you should be careful about, because some of the things you might not be aware of them. So,
Okay.
so any situation that can give rise to one or more project risks, that's your risk factor. Or let's say there's another example here. If let's say you are ordering your materials from a new supplier, so that new
Mm-hmm.
supplier, you don't know him, you have not worked with him for some time, you have never worked with him. Let's say now he tells you that no, we can supply you with let's say the reagents by this date. Let's say after in 2 weeks we'll supply you. We should be able, you will receive those things. And then just to check, that supplier was not actually giving you accurate information. He was just doing more of this marketing just so he can get you. Now the thing will end up getting delayed. But if you work with someone who you have been working with, you are more likely to be confident in by when they will supply you with it. Okay, so when you're identifying the specific risks, so you need to start looking at the risk factors first. Yeah, so and then you need to determine also what is the effect of each risk that you can come up with, that you have identified. What will be the effect of that risk and how will you manage it? Okay, now in terms of identifying those potential risks for each risk factor, there are a number of techniques that you can use. I think one of you mentioned asking experts. Yeah, that's one of the methods that you can use. So you can start off with brainstorming. Basically, here you have a session. Let's say it's like a meeting, a short meeting, where you are discussing possible risks. So you invite different people, different stakeholders, and you also call in your experts so they can give you some advice and some hints on which risks can possibly happen. And then there's a questionnaire survey. Here you just give out a questionnaire, they fill in, then you collect that. Okay, and then there's a industry benchmarking. What do you think that one is? Can you give an example of that one maybe?
Mine visits, for example.
Yes, mine visit. You benchmark it with,
Excuse me?
You benchmark it with what you're also trying to develop.
is what you're trying to develop. So it's like you are benchmarking, let's say, two different industries.
Yes.
For example, let's say you are setting up a plant for that is using, let's say, okay, let me use SX again. So for your solvent extraction, you know that you will be using a lot of organic there. And then let's say this is the first time this project is done, let's say worldwide. Okay, now, since you are not aware of some of the risks in SX, okay, because this is the first time it's done, you can actually benchmark with another industry. Let's say you can benchmark with the petrochemical industry. Then you can go to those oil refineries and then you go review what risks do they have there. And then they can give you some hints. Like that, you are benchmarking with the petrochemical industry and your solvent extraction mining industry. Just an example. It depends though on the project you're working on. Okay, and scenario analysis, what do you think about that one? Anyone?
Maybe I can try.
Yes.
I think scenario analysis goes with say for instance for a specific process you are working on. Say for instance the project is based on iron making, for instance. Then I think I don't know now if it's the same, more or less the same as brainstorming, but you have to think about everything else that go into the process before you even start the project itself,
Yes.
and what potential risk can then arise from that.
Yes, that's correct. You have to think about other, because it's like more for scenario planning. It's like you need to think of other possibilities. What else can go wrong? You give different scenarios. What if this happens? What if this happens? What if this happens? Like that. So all different scenarios. That's right.
But sir,
Yes.
sir,
Yes.
then how is that then different from brainstorming?
Brainstorming sometimes that's why maybe that's more of a session that you're having. Let's say it's like a meeting where you guys are discussing, let's say, because there you are having those experienced people, they will tell you exactly that, no, sometimes this happens.
Mm.
They'll give you hints based on their experience. But scenario planning is more of, sometimes it's more of it's theoretical. Sometimes it's just something that you think about. It's hypothetical. It's like creating different paths.
Okay.
Okay, there's also risk assessment.
So we go with worst case scenario, right?
Yeah, something like that. Use Murphy's law. What can possibly, you assume whatever can go wrong can possibly go wrong, then you need to identify now what can possibly go wrong.
Mm.
And then the next one is risk assessment. Here you're just assessing different risks. So you normally do that with even with safety officers and everyone else. You can work with those who are working in the field or those who are experienced. They feel it's like a form where you identify risks like that. Where you go in the field, then you identify all those potential hazards. Okay, then there's incident investigation. Okay, I think that one is it's an investigation, so it should be, that's where you want to understand now the root cause. You can actually read from there also. If let's say in the past you have worked on a similar project like that, and then there was an incident, you can read on that in that incident investigation, and then it will give you some hints on specific risks that you should be aware of. Then auditing and inspection. Okay, inspection, it's also required from us to do inspection. It's actually a legal requirement, especially for colleagues who are especially mechanical, electrical guys. In terms of, let's say, equipment, they must do regular inspections, and it's a legal requirement. Because just to give you an example, again, I like using SX because it's a risky area. Because let's say now you have a pump working in the settlers, next to the settlers there. That pump, let's say it starts overheating. There's a potential that it can result into fire in SX, then the entire plant can burn down. or when you're working on that project. So if they keep doing regular inspections, they might identify those risks or those hazards, that they might identify that this pump is getting hot or something like that, rather than just noticing it when it's late. Okay, and then there is hazard and operability study. I'm sure you guys probably came across it when you're doing your plant design. I think it's a
Yes, sir.
yes.
Hazard,
Yes.
Hello.
Can you shed some light on that one?
Joe, share some light.
Hazard basically based on what we understood it from plant design is just measures, safety measures one and will have to consider for the project and ensuring that it doesn't cause harmful impacts to the environment and to the people that are sort of implementing the project.
Yes, yes. When you're going to operate, yes, that's right. Because when you are designing that plant, it's also a project, you see. I
Yep.
think you've explained it well. Yeah. There is also what we call HAZLOC. There's also what we call hazard and HAZLOC. Okay, because remember, a hazard, it's everything in terms of risk, everything starts off with a hazard, because a hazard is like anything that has a potential to cause harm. So HAZLOC, they it's like hazard. It's the simplest thing for hazard location, hazard identification for hazard. So these trainings are usually given also even in industry. They are given on a regular basis. It's a legal requirement again, so that whenever you are going to start working on some projects, you need to be able to to identify risks and hazards in the place, so that uh, if anything about safety comes up, you yourself, you are protected. You can say, no, we have identified the risks. If anything happens, you are safe. Because sometimes when you're working on a project and you do not identify those risks, you might end up not achieving the objectives because you did not identify those risks. And then
So, but
yes,
what I feel as an industry, even though there are some risks that we do identify,
yes,
and they're within our hazard studies and whatnot,
yes,
I think the greater concern is how do we mitigate them now, like those arsenic concentrations in the air and stuff like that. And do we account for let's say there's a hazard that we mentioned, but we didn't prevent it from occurring. Do we now also include the measures of how to mitigate and to reduce the effect? Like for people now who inhale toxins and whatnot, it's smelters now. Do we give them medical aid and stuff like that? Or do we just stop at the fact that we say that no, we'll put a dust bag and whatnot, but then sometimes those things fail as well?
yeah, that's
Do
actually
we go beyond?
that's a very good question. Because okay, normally in industry, what they do is once they identify the risks, let's say once they do the risk assessment itself, that includes identifying risks and determining the impact and probabilities, and also coming up with mitigation efforts that will be done. They record all those things in what we call a risk register. And now, let's say in the plant, different sections will now be categorized to be given different categories in terms of the
In terms of risk?
yes, in terms of risk and hazards in that specific, let's say, unit process. Let's say your plant is having comminution, it's having its own zone. They call them zones. Let's say we call them zones depending
Right.
on the severity and the probability of the risks that are there. So comminution will have its own, leaching will have its own, let's say SX will have its own, electrowinning will have its own, so the furnaces will have their own, like that. And so now, in terms of the action plan that they draw up, it's also based on those risks, on those zones. And they even put up control measures. They will put up something like, let's say in Essex, they will tell you that not anyone can enter Essex without doing an induction. You must be fully aware of the risks and hazards in that in that plant. And yeah, so it is the same case also with, let's say, if you're going to the furnace, they will teach you things like you must not, let's say, pour water into the furnace. It will result into an
Yeah.
explosion and all those things. So that forms part of their risk register.
Risk register. Okay, thanks, sir.
Yes. Okay, now in terms of assessing the risk, okay, when you're assessing the risk, it's mainly focusing on determining the probability or the likelihood that the risk will happen and the consequences or the impact. So, because some of the risks have a big impact, but it's very unlikely for it to happen. So you need to assess all those things. So, okay, so now I said the risk consequences depend on the probability of occurrence and also on the severity. So you want to know, is this risk, can we perhaps just accept this risk, or perhaps we need to draw up an action plan, or perhaps we need to put up some sort of engineering controls in place, or we need to just use PPE, or that risk we can actually just accept it and just ignore it, and then maybe just monitor it from a distance. So it helps you with that. So with this, you need to know now the likelihood and the consequences or the impact for managing it. So they normally do it in terms of this. They call it a risk matrix. Okay. So what it does is it calculates a risk rating whereby you check your severity times your likelihood. Severity or the impact times the likelihood or the probability. Okay, you might find it in different formats. This is just an example, because normally probability can be usually in percentage and all that. So, but nonetheless, the whole concept is the same. So what they do is, let's say you multiply the likelihood and the severity. Let's say 1 times 1, yeah, it will be this block here. So this risk is trivial. So it's not a very big concern, because its impact on your project is very minimal, and also the chances for it to happen, it's also very minimal. Okay, then there is this one, let's say here 3 times 3, yeah, this one is moderate, that will be 9. So the risk there, it's moderate in terms of your risk rating. It's moderate, so you need to keep an eye on it. So you need to decide now, if you put up a mitigation plan, what should you do about it? Okay? That's in terms of your risk response. We'll look at it later. There are also other risks. Let's say now, let's say the severity is highest, set 5, you said it's highest, and the likelihood or the chances for it to happen is also highest. So like here, you have a risk rating of 25. That's 5 times 5. So this is intolerable. So it's just way too much. You cannot afford to take this risk. Okay. So they say it's unacceptable. I put a small diagram here. Okay, they say it's unacceptable. It's just too much. So in that way, in that risk now, there are ways also to get past it. So you need to be aware of all this risk for your project.
Red flag.
There?
No, I just said it's a red flag in other words.
Yeah, it's a red flag, that one. Okay, now, in terms of risk response now, like the question you were asking now, what do you do now? You have identified them, okay? You have assigned them some probabilities and their impact. So what after that? What will you do? So this you need to develop a risk response. In here, you need to develop a risk management strategy. So you need to develop a strategy or action plan. These are some tactics that you're gonna use to address all the risks that you have identified. And that response will depend on whether that risk is positive or negative. Okay, this diagram here is now showing you what the response that you can give depending on the risk. Okay, just for example here, if your probability is low, the probability is low, and the impact is low, that risk you can actually accept it. You accept it in terms of like you will not do much about it. You can actually just keep monitoring it because it has no major effect on the project objectives. Okay. So now let's say now we can come to this one where the impact is low, but the probability is high. Probability of it happening is high. So such kind of risk, you can actually choose to transfer or to share it, depending on whether it is negative, it's a negative risk or it's a positive risk. If it's a negative risk, let's say now you don't have the expertise to do that. So you don't want to take chances. So you can actually just transfer that risk to experts. This is when now you give it out to another company, you transfer it to another company so that that company can deal with that specific section. Here you're gonna give it out, you contract it out, or you subcontract, or you give it out as a tender. So now they have that risk. For you, it's just to tell them that what the deliverables that you want from them, but they are the ones taking that risk. Don't forget the business now, when you are working on business, if it's your business, is just about risk also. So they need to manage that risk. Sometimes, okay, if the risk is positive, you can share it. You can share it. Let's say you found a deposit for gold, but you don't have enough money for doing further exploration. Because let's say when you are doing exploration, you notice that there's actually a bit more gold, like the deposit might actually be larger than you thought. Now you don't have funds for that. So you can actually share that risk, because when you're exploring, there's a chance that you might find, let's say you might find gold there and you might not find gold there. That's a risk by itself. And you're not willing to spend your money on it. So you can actually share that risk with another company and tell them that, you know what, just explore, we'll share, let's say the profit, or we'll share the deposit 50-50. And then they will take that risk and then they will do the exploration. Like that, both of you are winning. It's a mutual benefit for both of you. Okay. If the impact is high and the probability also is high, this is again red flag, like what you were saying. So in this case, what you're gonna do is you either avoid it completely, you just avoid it, you don't do it, or you can exploit it. If it's negative, you avoid it. But if let's say you are benefiting from it, you exploit it. Here it means you just try to catalyze the process so that you can actually benefit more from it. And if the impact is high and the probability is low, you can mitigate or enhance. You can mitigate by coming up with plans on what to do, let's say to prevent any harm to the project objectives. Or you can enhance it by making it easier for you to achieve this, to maximize the benefits from it. In terms of mitigation, there are a number of things you can do. You can either eliminate or substitute. You can put up some, let's say, engineering controls, administrative controls. You can use PPE. It depends now on what kind of risk you are dealing with. Are we together so far?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and then preparing a risk management plan. The risk management plan here, it should have, you need to put in your risk factors, associated risks, the likelihood and impact for each risk response plan, then your communication plan. That diagram there is just a typical risk management plan that you can have. Okay, and then the risk register. Here you're gonna put all those risks that you are having, that you have identified. So you put the risk, put in the risk, you put in the date, the risk description, what is that risk? What is the likelihood, the impact of that risk? You put it in there, you flag it, whether it's red, yellow, depending on its effect, then the severity, and you assign it to someone, you delegate it to someone who's going to manage it. You're like, hey, it's a project sponsor, project manager, that in mitigation action, what will they do about that risk? So like that, it's clear for everyone. Okay, and then this diagram here, this model here is just showing everything we've done so far now, as far as risk management is concerned. So when you're doing your risk assessment, you started off with risk identification, you do your risk assessment, analysis, and your risk evaluation. This in terms of your probabilities and impact. And then you do your risk treatment, your mitigation now. What will you do? And then when you're doing all that, you need to communicate and consult. You need for all those stages, you need to communicate and consult. And then at the same time, you also need to monitor and review. Then this thing becomes cyclic. So it's cyclic, it doesn't end there. You keep doing it again and again. As new risks are involved, are coming up, you address them also like that. Are we good so far?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay, so these are all the steps now in terms of your risk management. It means like that you are able to take on any risks. But some of the risks now you need to evaluate now. You see, because some of the risks are just too risky for you to take on. So you need to always find a way out. Okay, so is there something perhaps that you want to understand? This is the last slide for risk management. After a break and because we're gonna have to log in again, we're gonna go to project control, monitoring and control. But remember
No
again,
question.
there's monitoring here again, or there's no question. This monitoring again here, so which means you will still be monitoring, because remember you are doing project execution. When you're executing the project, you need to control also at the same time. So you will not just do one thing alone. So it's cyclic. Okay, we can have a short break then, and then you can come back to risk to project monitoring and control. This will be the next section. How long should the break be?
1 hour.
1 hour.
Just 5 minutes or what?
Okay, 5 minutes.
I'd
5
say
minutes.
So
logging.
10 past. How many minutes? What time will that be? Can you come back at 15 past?
Okay.
Okay.
15.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay, it's cool.
Cool.
Sharp.